interesting challenge to say, all right, how deep in the weeds should we be, and what lessons might be applicable to all of our customer base, and that's obviously a super important thing. But also, where might we get led a little astray, and do need to focus on the parts of a business that are a little more scalable. And obviously, this is hard for every company. I do think there's something because of how deeply the nature of security is rooted in the properties of systems that your business might run, or you might run at your home, or wherever else it may be, or whatever the things that you care about security for are, do make it a little more challenging, and I think almost require this kind of gap between the most some generic product could do for you and the management that needs to be administered in order to make it useful. And I think this is another thing that is so interesting about the security industry.
Hey folks, welcome to Security Time, podcast curated for cybersecurity and tech folks. I'm your host, Nicholas Moy. I lead cybersecurity for Secret Automation. And today we have Josh here, co-founder of Zip Security, previously at Palantir, and he's building something to make enterprise security easy for everyone. Welcome, Josh. Thanks for taking the time to come on.
Thanks for having me on, Nick. I really appreciate it. I know when we were talking about it, I was saying we've done so many of these Zooms where we just chat about security for a while. I think we've already have a good few podcasts under our belt, but excited to have one to share with everyone.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think, and Josh and I have had a chance to get to know each other over almost a year, maybe even. I don't know. I feel like it's gone by pretty fast. So, I think maybe it's been at least 9 months.
Yeah.
So, I think we met a while ago now, and definitely have enjoyed. We probably should have recorded some of those Zoom calls, but no.
We definitely should have.
Yeah, and I've appreciated your thoughts on the industry. I have a lot of strong thoughts. I don't know if anyone knows that, but and you have a lot of strong thoughts, so it's pretty good. Shout out to Nick for introducing us, by the way, over at Crosswire. Thanks, Nick. Great name. So, and I think, Josh, we were talking a little earlier, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, being a co-founder for a security startup, trying to build, something to solve a problem for companies. Last week was the big Black Hat DEF CON. It's basically probably not over yet when, as of this recording, Hacker Summer Camp, hashtag Hacker Summer Camp. What do you think about Black Hat?
Man, I haven't had the chance to go yet, actually. I think it is always a thing every summer when the DEF CON Black Hat thing kind of happens. It's interesting. It kind of impacts everything, right? It's like investors are asking you if you're going, and then you have a ton of people who you might have as customers or in the pipeline are going, and just kind of everyone goes. So I definitely think for a small industry like ours, all these conferences and opportunities for anyone to get together are a great thing. So I think those are always opportunities worth taking. For us, I didn't think about going this year, mostly because none of our customers really go. Our customers are both kind of one-person security teams, two-person security teams, but then also we serve a ton of companies who don't actually have any security professionals who work there that we're trying to empower to do the work because they have to do the work somehow. So we didn't end up going this year. I'm sure at some point we'll find ourselves behind a booth in Vegas, but we didn't make it out this year. How was your experience, Nick? I know you were able to.
No, I mean, Black Hat is something else. It's like the Black Hat DEF CON, part of the classic kind of security conference circuit. You have RSA earlier in the year, get into Black Hat, you go to DEF CON. It was interesting. I mean, it's funny you said it's like a small industry like ours. It feels pretty big when you get there. There's just tens of thousands of people in Vegas, all there for cybersecurity. Everywhere I look, they're flashing lights, big shiny booths, and Even if you're not on the business hall floor, there are literally different companies have set up shop. They've turned a bar into like their meeting meeting center for executive briefings and everything. It's definitely a sight. And I think, look, it's cool to see that, like, hey, these companies are doing well. They're taking their customers out there. They're building relationships. What I always wonder, what is the conference for? Depending on who you are. And I think it's just kind of, and I think a recurring theme in our conversation today is going to be kind of observations on the security industry. Our small quaint security industry that we are, have the pleasure of being a part of. Yeah, I enjoyed meeting with a few folks, having one-on-one meetings, learning more about them and what they're doing. you know Other people like yourself building companies. There's a lot of cool things out there, and there were a lot of, I'd say, I met most of the people I met with outside of like more established security companies were founders who are still in stealth, super early, still bootstrapped, haven't raised, maybe only angel investment. And just hearing kind of the enthusiasm and, like, I mean, you're still very much, it's early stage, goes for a while, but it was cool to see that. And then also, I think then there's just a lot of other people there, and it's nice to meet. Sometimes it's the easiest place to see people in person because they're gonna be there anyway. But I personally can't do the heat, so
Yeah, no, I get it, and I think some of these conferences definitely take a lot of hate too. For there's the however big CrowdStrike booth or whatever there may be, and yeah, some people don't like that. But at the end of the day, I think one great follow on of all these things is it just kind of serves as a bit of a rallying point for all sorts of other people in the industry. So we could give a little shout out to be something like B-Sides also, right? I
oh
think
yeah.
the conference maybe the weekend before, and then you have a ton of great practitioners, including at least one person on the ZipCap table go do talks and that kind of stuff, and all those things are great. And I certainly still consider myself a practitioner, as I know everyone at Zip does. I haven't really podcast,
Yeah,
so
that's good. Good for you. You kept your end of the bargain up. No, and I mean, shout out to B-Sides Las Vegas and all the other events. The very much, I think, the best examples of the community coming together. There's so many kind of unconferences, smaller events, and get-togethers. I think there's one called like Cybersecurity, and that stuff has come a long ways. And I did actually, I spent more time at B-Sides Las Vegas this year than I did at Black Hat itself. But and it makes sense that, like, hey, if it weren't for Black Hat getting all those people there, maybe it'd be harder to get to B-Sides Las Vegas, because otherwise I might be like, well, why else would I go? But
yeah,
it
not
was,
to mention, I think the security industry is definitely thought about, and it's easy inside looking out. But I think people definitely think security industry is not the easiest one to break into, right? It's like, oh, cybersecurity, it's kind of like scary. A lot of the branding in the market is kind of scary, right? It's like there's a lot of kind of war-related imagery and branding, which I don't particularly care for, and
yeah.
I don't think a lot of people feel it's necessarily super inviting. And despite, there sort of tons of resources to kind of start breaking your way into the field, and certainly a lot more than there used to be. I think there's also something to be said for a field that's not thought about as particularly accessible, for there to be literally a week where, if you go, you're going to meet some people and you can start to kind of make your way in a way that I'm not sure the security industry would have quite as much otherwise. So I think that's kind of
Yeah, totally. No, and there definitely needs to be more of it, right? Where it can be accessible. I think it's like those are the highs of like any type of event that brings people together. It makes it more accessible. I mean, because there's not enough people in security, even if it feels like it kind of did feel like everyone in the industry was in one place, and you're kind of like, well, where's everybody else? Is anyone managing that sock? Are those socks being managed? Is that team threat hunting? No, they're not threat hunting today. This week we're not threat hunting, friends. It's like I don't want to be on that team where you draw straws and you're like, well, sorry, so I'm going to the conference. You have to finish that pen test.
That's funny. Do you feel like when you were there, and I know you're just there for a day or two, do you have any sort of identity crisis where, one moment you think people are thinking about you as a practitioner Nick, and one moment it's like vendor Nick, and you have to
Yeah, no, it is. It would be lying if there's not some insecurity there. It is and I've thought about it since just kind of getting into the security space from working at a security company versus just being like a practitioner at maybe a like previous company was not in security at all, open API SaaS, and yeah, thought about that. It's kind of like, well, will my friends want to see me? Will, or will they try to run the other direction? No, I think I think yeah, I think a lot of that is more in my head than it is. I think at least there's been a little more evolution. I remember early on in my career, I don't know if this was what people intended to sort of teach me, but the message I got from a lot of my more seasoned peers was like, there's us, security practitioners. We do all the wizardry cool stuff. We're like security engineer extraordinaire. And then there's the vendors. They're the people who show up at your office and bring donuts and they're like, hey, you want to talk about how to solve your problems? And, over time, I had to get over this kind of hurdle where it's like it doesn't have to be so adversarial. Not to use such a loaded security industry favorite term, but it doesn't have to be, right? And it's like the security industry, I guess, like you were saying earlier, is so loaded with all these terms where it's like attacks, adversarial, blah blah blah, pictures of explosions and stopping things, defending things, and it's just sort of like whatever, man. Like let's not get so out. It's getting carried away here. Yeah, no, I think we have to work together. I mean, I'm particularly passionate about like security practitioners have so much to offer, right? You having been one yourself, you're still one, of course, obvious. Me similarly, but we I mean, I think we both feel strongly that like we do have a point of view. We've spent time trying trying to solve security problems for different companies, trying to do it in the ways that we could with what we had and when what we didn't have. Um, uh-oh. And we can't do it all by ourselves, and we have to work together, I guess, with the people like, when I was at Expedia Group, we built a lot in house. You could argue like, was that thing really necessary? Was that thing really necessary? Some of it we felt like we had to because we would go to the vendor community and they would say some version of that's not interesting to us, harder to monetize, it's not going to create a cash cow, it's not super profitable, so we're not interested in innovating in that space. Who those vendors are shall go unnamed, but and then I think it's kind of like, but had those vendors spend a little more time invested, with the security practitioner community, not just to generate like a transaction, but to really think about the products they're building. I just think it's a missed opportunity because I talk to a lot of early stage, security founders looking for, maybe angel investment or something else. And like, while I have insane amounts of respect for the work it takes to build a security product and security solutions, you also can't build it in a vacuum. And that's only going to go so far, right? At the end of the day, somebody's going to use it. You could say maybe your product's not built for security practitioners, and that's fine. But if it is, and you're not talking to security practitioners, you're not hiring security practitioners, and you're not a security practitioner, I don't, you're going to have to do something. I mean, that's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, and it's obvious also just misguided. Anytime you're trying to build a company, you have to talk to you and just be disciplined about who your user base is. I think there's a bit of a unique thing about security that makes something here difficult. And really the tension to think about here for me, and something I think about a lot, is, you're going to take VC money to build a security company, right? There's expectations. You get to a billion, $10 billion outcomes. And of course, the critical thing there is scale and scalability. And you have that on one side. And on the other side, there's definitely an element to which, for me, from at least a philosophical perspective, security is really a property of systems. And at any company you might work at, any of our past employers, right? It's, all these systems have kind of unique properties that have different security requirements that you might think about like needing to guarantee. And I think it's one of the things that makes security so hard. And you end up in all these situations, right, where people think about solutions where you basically just try to co-opt everyone at the organization into security. Oh, everyone here is a security, person. And obviously that works in some cases better than others. Certainly is not any sort of silver bullet, but I think it is one thing that's really hard for product companies in the security world is you have to really find a kind of unique place where there is a common enough problem that either security practitioners or whoever you're trying to serve with your security company. And I think, it's important to kind of be a little disciplined about that. And especially at the early stage, just like pick who you want your customers to be. I think there's an interesting challenge to say, all right, how deep in the weeds should we be? And, what lessons might be applicable to all of our customer base? And that's obviously a super important thing, but also where might we get let a little stray and do need to focus on the parts of a business that are a little more scalable. And obviously this is hard for every company. I do think there's something because of how deeply the nature of security is rooted in the like properties of systems that your business might run, or you might run like at your home or wherever else it may be, or whatever the things that you care about security for are, do make it a little more challenging. And I think almost require this kind of gap between the most some generic product could do for you and the management that needs to be administered in order to make it useful. And I think this is another thing that is so interesting about the security industry. Everyone in the security industry loves to put the word manage before whatever their product is, so like managed security service provider, like managed sponsor, whatever. And it is interesting that, security products do have this like generally, I think, uniquely high requirement for management. And I think this is why, especially if you think about problem areas that I consider hard, like things in the space of access controls, where these things are kind of trying to represent a fundamentally dynamic process that, that's always going to be changing at your business. And then there's some natural decay, right? And there's like a ton of ongoing management work that needs to happen. And then you think about like, okay, well, where are the areas there where there are like repeatable problems that merit a venture scalable business is certainly not an easy question at all. And it's tough, right? Because I know there are a few people building companies in this space, and arguably ours is one of them, but it is something really common in security. And I actually just heard it from a customer we were talking to yesterday. And actually one of the first anecdotes from a customer I heard when we were starting Zip is like, oh, we bought so-and-so product, and then we paid one of two things. Either one, we paid basically our first year contract value for the licenses to have so-and-so company implement the product. Or more commonly, we bought the licenses and we didn't really understand what we bought. We couldn't figure out how to use them. We didn't really do anything with it. We never really got the product installed. And then obviously you churn after the first year, which isn't good for anyone. But I think it is a uniquely difficult product in the or a problem, I should say, in the security industry, where this kind of thing happens, right? And people have security tools. They don't really understand how they interact or how much work is going to be required to make them effective, especially on an ongoing basis. And, obviously there's some value there. It means there's a lot of work for security folks to do. But man, it's just way too hard. I think it's one of the things that in the next like 5 to 10 years is going to have to get way, 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 way easier. And I know one other thing we talk about sometimes is this like job gap idea in the cybersecurity world. And I do think this is a lot of where that lives, right? As well, because there's this management burden, we're going to need to hire for this role. And then you talk to people who actually maybe get hired for roles like this. And it's not that easy to do there either, because it's not like you're in the fundamental business processes of the company or anything like that. So, we just kind of have this like job gap that I don't really is going to be the thing that solves the problem. Certainly not in its stated numbers. And there's probably a lot more we could be doing, to just make it a few orders of magnitude easier to do the work for all sorts of people.
Yeah, no, I mean, totally. And that was a big topic. I mean, it's been a big topic since I feel like the beginning of time. I remember back in DC, when I was at the Obama administration, it's like, hey, there was a whole other part of the entire government looking at, with Congress and Homeland Security on the kind of filling that job gap and what does the skills and training look like. I forgot the name of the task force. There's many of these things, and it continues to be a topic, and I hear people talk about the missing million, and I don't know, I feel pretty strongly that, like, pragmatically speaking, even if there is a missing million, you say, hey, there's a million job posts and they're unfilled and this exists and we're not, we need these people. True, sure, maybe. But if you need them and you don't have them, and like you waited a day and they still didn't show up, then they don't exist. So, okay, if they don't exist, what are you going to do about it, right? Whether you are a security practitioner, okay, you're not going to be able to fill every job rec that you have and every job rec that you need for a variety of reasons because the supply is short. Some things lend themselves well to managed services, as you were saying, because there are a lot of things that just need kind of care and feeding and management the way they're built today. I don't know if that's always, hopefully, not going to be the case forever. And then there are a lot of things where it's like maybe a lot of things have to change. And everything. I guess it seems to me, at least in my experience, big companies, big institutions, any large group of people, they like to take a problem like the missing million and this job gap of skills, and then it becomes the reason nothing works. It's like, well, because of the missing million, that's why this is not successful. That's why this doesn't work. That's why, and this happens, I think, a lot in business. But then, if that's the case, shouldn't you just focus on a different part of the problem? Shouldn't you just start like, okay, if they're not going to exist, you need to change the problem that you have. The problem that you have cannot be we don't have enough the right people. That's going to take a really long time for that to happen. And who is to say what that will look like 10, 20, 40, 50 years from now? But what we know today is like there's technology, there's data, there's users, there's access, there's information flying around everywhere. It's not secure. And I don't know, some of that technology needs to change. It's not even just what are the products we're building for it. Some of it needs to be like, hey, how we do compute should change. I don't know. Maybe how we do storage should change. Identity and access management has been built around a paradigm that has existed for 40 years at least. And it's like, holy crap. Yeah. And it's kind of like access control lists are about as ancient as like physical security, and physical security is about as ancient as human civilization. Okay. We literally should be thinking a little harder. Just take some of it. If we just took a little bit of all the funding that went into the cybersecurity industry and put it into a few long tail problems, you, me, and everybody else would be eternally grateful if only 10% of those succeeded. Because those long tail problems, somebody's got to start working on them now. And I think some of that has to go beyond like, I don't know. I talk to a lot of founders. I love the startup ecosystem. I'm never going to go back to Fortune 500. Quote me now. It's like, I will not do it. Not anytime soon. Not until, yeah, exactly. Knock on wood. But, it's, there's so many solutions being built that are like, well, this is what we're building. It's a super amazing solution. And it depends on the insecurities and inherent crappiness of all these other systems. So it's like
Like,
we built a great security solution for a perfect environment that does not exist. And it's kind of like, and ironically, the place that some of the cleaner environments exist are startups because they're so small. You're like, hey, this startup is cloud native. All the infrastructure is in AWS, GCP, or Azure. They have 10 laptops. All the laptops have Jamf for being managed. And there's like, and maybe they're paying someone to manage all the laptops. Everything's like crisp and clean. There's no inherently trusted network of just file servers with sensitive data hanging out there. Everything requires, identity-based authentication because everything they don't have any systems. They just have SaaS. They just and so they have to control access to that. It's almost like the benefit of lack of centralized systems, because as you were talking about, systems of properties, and it's like, but in a typical corporate environment, that stuff scares me so much. Like I really feel for the folks on security teams at like a Microsoft, and there's that whole thing recently of big news that everyone's talking about, the Tenable CEO very famously giving a whiplashing to Microsoft out there in front of Congress. And it's like, I'm going to wait and see. I would like to know exactly. I would like a real write-up, right? And we all know what that looks like, and that takes time. Once the lawyers at a big company have determined they've kind of concluded the situation, then a write-up can come out because it's a publicly traded company anyways. But, that's what I'd want to know. And then we'd actually say, okay, here's what we need to focus on. Here's what we need to go do. I just think we can't keep trying to, those big environments have so many things, so many variables. You're like, well, we have 20,000 laptops. We have servers in AWS, Azure, and in colos. we have Linux, Windows, and within Linux, we have 5 flavors of that. We've got RHEL, Debian, and AMZ Linux and everything else. And it's just kind of like, yeah, that's hard. That's hard because you're trying to build a wedge of like, there's all these security solutions built in a vacuum, trying to secure something that is inherently about the lowest common denominator in any company is the weakest link. And it's like, but those are the things that you were saying, like, but that's venture scalable. And I think to some extent, generally speaking, that's probably true because it's like lowest common denominator. It exists enough that the TAM is big enough that in your pitch deck, people will be like, okay, I buy that. Here's a check. But then if we take a step back as a security practitioner, let's just live in a bubble in an ivory tower. Like, it's, maybe if that's the thing, maybe hopefully the lowest common denominator and the thing that's scalable that you can get funding for are what that company needs. But there's too many variables. So it's like, it freaks me out, right? Having to defend a corporate network at scale, of which I had to do, is like, it's very hard work. Your blood pressure and heart rate goes up and down with the logs. With the logs you're monitoring. And you're just kind of like, oh my God, oh, okay, just the network, the traffic, the access, the audit logs, the system audit logs, and you're just in all the log folders on those Linux boxes going into your wherever you want to send it to.
That's exactly just the kind of problem description where I remember maybe it was a couple of times we chatted ago that you mentioned this missing million idea. I hadn't heard it put that way, but it's a beautiful way to put it. And, you hear, some of the problem descriptions like the ones you just gave, and it's like more people, I really just don't think is the solution here. It's like maybe something like making the problem 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more accessible or easier. Seems like it could actually take us a lot farther. And, 1 million people is a lot. That is really a lot of people.
A lot of people.
So I would just compare it, and people say that's just in the U.S. or something, right? I've seen estimates range 750,000 to 3 million, and obviously there's some areas this is super critical, right? I think now there's like a GS-15 job that might pay like $300,000 a year. There's like 1 or 2 of them at CISA because you need some super skilled people.
You doing some research on the job board there, Josh? Just in case.
So yeah, there's like obviously places like that, and there, I mean, there's certainly a role for or space for it, I should say. But I mean, I always think about this. If you think about it, just like population of America, what is it, like 350 million people or something like that? Let's say like 200 to 250 million are kind of in the workforce. A million people is a lot, right? We're talking about like 0.5%. I would say like I think the biggest industry in the United States is trucking, and I think maybe something like 1% of Americans are truck drivers, and like 3% of Americans work in trucking. So like 9 million people or something like that. And it's like, whoa, we're we're talking like on that scale for cybersecurity practitioners. Like, I really don't think that. Not only is it unlikely to solve the problem, I also just don't think it's the world we want to live in. Right? If you want to take, you kind of floated a physical security analogy before. All right, what are the companies out there with physical security presences? Well, you have, like, I don't know, maybe a bank, this kind of thing, but it's really not consistent. It's something I say a lot. It's really not super consistent with the idea of like a free society where you have to have a security professional on staff of any kind, and obviously physical security is a little different for all sorts of reasons, right? Because, you pay, it's a public good, you pay money and taxes to whoever, and they can, arrest
hopefully
people,
keep you safe,
or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
No, but there's also deterrent, right? They can like arrest people that break into your store, where if those are people overseas in the in countries around the world, right? Like you're not really paying taxes for anything in that authority. That being said, I think some of the stuff the Justice Department did in the last couple of years, where they like put bounties, like a $10 bounty or something like that. I think these things are really effective, because I think it's something people forget a lot in the cybersecurity industry is like, again, it's not like national security or physical security where there's like a deterrent effect to like why you might exercise some of these things, but you really need to play defense because people are playing offense, right? Like first and foremost. And I think people forget this a lot. It's like, well, there are people playing offense out there, especially, when you're playing defense. And I think it's something we're thinking about a lot because, I think it has a lot of interesting implications in how you think about your own tactics, right? You think about, okay, well, these are people with, budgets and OKRs the same way our companies have them every quarter or every half a year, whatever it may be. And I think it's something that like is missing from conversations a lot. Is nobody's doing this for their own health. It's
I wholeheartedly agree. I think it is detrimental to our ability as security practitioners to achieve kind of the outcome that we want, to secure the companies that we work at, to protect the data that we're responsible for. If we pretend that the problem we're dealing with is some kind of ethereal, magical, evil force of nature that is unpredictable, like the weather, but, super damaging. No, it is a lot of like remarkably ruthlessly rational and economically efficient individuals and groups organized into all kinds of ways, and they're like highly motivated and very capital efficient. They're really great at building these things. They have a very burgeoning and lively and dynamic industry of solutions being built and services being offered. And it is not like it's not magic. It just doesn't happen on its own. There's not like a evil being on the other side of this. They're not orcs there. Palantir's offices are littered with like Lord of the Rings stuff. So,
I know.
So, I mean, I remember that the wall of t-shirts at like the Virginia office that I've been to for fun once. It was like, hey, it's like this is cool, but they're not actually like orcs on the other side. There's like people wearing khakis. Like it's that boring. It's that mundane. There's like people wearing khaki pants, people wearing jeans and t-shirts, and they have offices with stinky microwaves and all that junk. Because
didn't see the Lord of the Rings until after I left Palantir.
That's hilarious. Wow. That's why you left. They're like, sorry, Josh, you've never seen the movie, so you're out. You lied to us. We thought you had seen it. You had 90 days to watch it once you joined the company. That would be funny. I mean, and I think because if you understand that, you can say, hey, our job is not to fight evil doers and magical beasts. Our job is to like secure these systems, build better systems, build enduring and lasting kind of ways and strategies, or to give ourselves as many ways as possible to deal with the problem. And I think that makes it more accessible. And then we could just talk about it like it's solving security problems just like making more money. You need different ways to do it. You have costs to do those things, and you have outcomes that you're trying to achieve. You need to try different things. If something doesn't work, you have not only a competitor, but you have someone trying to destroy you. So it should be very motivating and very efficient in that
Yeah,
sense, where it's
exactly.
like it is not imaginary. Companies go to the market to compete selling products all the time. In security, you wake up every day and you go to the office and hope you haven't been hacked and someone's not trying to steal every single thing, or but you have all this stuff to go do. And I don't know. And I think it would look a little different. I have to believe, and I imagine, like, if we thought about our problem a little differently, it wouldn't look the way it does today. Instead, today we're like, let's go sell all these solutions that work perfectly when everything is perfect to everybody who isn't perfect, because no one is perfect. No company is perfect. No infrastructure is perfect. I've never met and seen a perfect network environment. I've never
But
seen
this
a.
is the thing, like, what does perfect even mean? Because,
It doesn't
the
exist.
thing is a great example, but, you know, so much of this work, I think, is trying to model like real, at the end of the day, I suppose, like social interactions between people. And there's just a tremendous natural decay to all these things, right? And I think it's, as you're saying, it's so important to think about how are we thinking about that as design principle rather than a design constraint, right? How, like, in what ways do we want to kind of lean into that complexity to enable our customers? Because that's for sure just the nature of the problem.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and you start somewhere, right? There's so many, right? Both that there are so many challenges and opportunities. There's like we should take some first principles thinking to, and the security community has a lot to offer. It's like, let's go reimagine some of just how computers work. Come on, like that would be great. Let's go reimagine some protocols, right? Because the internet is built on protocols that have been around for quite a long time. Um, but we don't. Instead, we're like, let's build a black box that connects to another black box that then we have to go invest to develop a lot of integrations between black boxes and other black boxes. There's so many economic inefficiencies. You just like, oh my goodness, any economist looking at this would be like, this is awful, this is terrible. And there are no economists working in security, not enough. It's like this is a terrible approach to solving this bigger problem. I just on the integrations, I ask everyone I talk to. I mean, I probably talked to you about it, where I was like, every security startup needs to build these like 15 integrations. And then every security start builds the same 15 integrations. They're like, I got to build it with Slack and Jira and this thing and that thing. And everyone's actually just investing a lot of money and time. I hope the investors aren't listening. It's like all that money is being invested to go build the same integrations over and over again. And because we live in this world where it's like, well, I just this thing to that thing, and the whole concept of point solutions. I not to use it as a derogatory term, but it's a reality too. Whereas you're saying it's like, well, to build a scalable business, when you start out, you're trying to pick a problem you could hopefully do something useful about, but then I don't know. I personally feel like a lot of money gets spent on things that have been solved and could 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 be leveraged multiple times, hopefully. And I think there's some businesses I've seen out there trying to monetize that, hopefully. And I think there's more, but it would require a rethinking of how you build a security startup. It would require a rethink about how you build a SaaS business, and say it's like as sexy as like find a wedge, land and expand, you know, because those are the most capital efficient business models. addressing some of the horizontal problems in our industry, where it's like integrations are a problem, data, where it's at, who has it, how much of it, and how to make use of it to solve a problem. Those things are like, yeah, people are like, that's too expensive, too fancy. That's not a 10-year, $10 billion problem. Like, take your big ideas out of here. Get out of here. Like, who do you think you are? Sorry. That's my impression of like a very successful venture capitalist.
um, yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think you touched on a couple interesting things there. One thing I think about a lot is that company where you're building a Slack and a Jira integration, all these things. Those aren't security features like integrations per se, but you could very well build a security company out of that. I think it's an interesting thing. I think about it for us too, right? Sometimes I think about us as Zip. Sometimes I think about us as Zip Security, and it's kind of an interesting thing. And when do you want to pick and associate your like brand with security? I think it's a bit of a hard chasm to cross either way once you pick, um, especially in the security part of the industry. I wanted to ask you though, since you touched on it before in like some of your government experience, I'm very curious for your read on some of it's kind of like the role the government started to carve out for itself insofar as you're interested in it in the last few years. Because I think in the kind of 2015 timeframe, there's a lot of grappling of like, oh, cybersecurity is new, even still, right? And obviously there had been a long history before that. And there's crypto wars and like all these other things, but it does seem like obviously with CISA getting established, it seems like they're really starting to find their feet. I think the DOJ stuff and like the rewards for information leading to arrests of people like behind certain ransomware or something, I think it is very interesting. I read an account of like I think during one like big ransomware spell where they're I can't remember the name, but mostly targeting some exchange vulnerability that the FBI was actually like looking for them and actually like broke into someone's and like patch, right? And we were talking about mostly defense against foreign enemies, but obviously people have things like insider threats, or people are scared of their own government in some cases, and rightfully so. But yeah, there's just a ton of interesting stuff going on. I don't know how much you kind of like
Yeah.
think your day-to-day work, but
Yeah, no, I mean, and you're, yeah, you've probably got some thoughts on that too, working at Palantir. I mean, I am, I'm very like, I think very optimistic and actually seeing the development over the last like 10-ish so years. Like cybersecurity was such a controversial hot potato in Congress back in like 2012 that any semblance of like more proactive engagement between the public sector, specifically the federal government, and the private sector on cybersecurity was painted as this is going to be regulations, regulations, regulations. This is bad for everybody. Go away. Stay out of it. You're the government. Since then, the cybersecurity framework co-developed with pretty much everybody under the sun. There were frameworks out. There were workshops that we did at the time all across the country with the public sector, the private sector, everybody, all kinds of stakeholders, held at universities around the country. NIST, Department of Commerce, and DHS were partners in doing that. And now, come full circle, like it's a huge sort of at least provides a common taxonomy for a lot of security professionals across industry to work together on. And, at the time, it might not have sounded like the most exciting thing, but, looking back, it actually, that's one of the things where like government can do that, because for another company, it may not make economic sense for them to spend money to convene stakeholders across a diverse group unless they could draw a clear line back to their EBITDA and their bottom line and say like, hey, if we go convene all these people to go develop this, is going to be great for us and the whole wide world. Instead, in the industry, if you say, hey, we'll leave it up to the industry to self-remediate these problems, it's going to be very specific. You have things like the payment card industry, which is very specific to managing liability and risk to the payment card industry, and really the payment card networks who control PCI DSS. Go ask a retailer and go ask a merchant, go ask the different stakeholders in the payment card industry, and they all have very strong opinions, I'm sure. I have my own, about the usefulness and the validity and how it's going to keep up or not. But it's very hard to do that because the motivations are built into the economics of the businesses that are the stakeholders for those things. And so it won't be
Which isn't the
necessarily
worst thing, by the way.
bad, right? But then
Yeah.
it won't be, it'll be narrow. Maybe the challenge is, as everything in our economy is so interconnected, when you take a narrow view to things, you're just abstracting away everything else as if everything else doesn't matter. But it does. But then how do you try not to solve everything and boil the ocean for your industry? So government can provide, I think, a common forum to do that and convene that. And the government is invested to do that. And, I'm pretty pleased that like CISA exists. And, I have a lot of friends, people I had the privilege of working with a long time ago, who are over there working really hard to kind of advance that mission and get people together to really say like, hey, there are productive ways for us to work together. It doesn't all have to be bad. But I also think the public policy, it has the awareness has evolved quite a bit. But back as far as like 2010, 2012, the Department of Justice, different U.S. attorneys were very active, working with the Secret Service and pursuing different organized crime groups and criminals overseas on, different cyber crime that they were committing in the U.S. or against U.S. citizens. And and I've seen a lot of those cases are public, where the U.S. attorneys working with the Secret Service were very successful in getting a number of those folks and actually bringing them back and taking them to court in the U.S. And so I think, that's one way. I know Microsoft seems to be very active collaborating. Their digital crime unit collaborates quite, I don't know, proactively is the word, with lots of different stakeholders and taking down botnets and everything else. Because Microsoft has, I don't work at Microsoft, so I don't know. But as far as I can tell, they're invested, right? They have such a large user base. Like if something is bad for the public in cybersecurity, it's bad for Microsoft. And I think, I'm optimistic that we can take this further, because there are some things, if we leave it up purely to economics, the incentives won't be there. It could take time. It's also like rolling the dice of like the economics of publicly traded companies being accountable to not just shareholders, but to the people who aren't shareholders, but are their customers, and what they do, don't do, and how they, disclose and don't disclose what is or isn't going on. I think it's important. Yeah, it sucks in the short term. It creates all kinds of organizational challenges, but it is something that requires awareness, and like we have to talk about it. Yeah.
I love the NIST 171-800 example. I think it's a great one, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this thought experiment I do pretty regularly. So something I think a lot about is something like NIST 171-800. Great framework, very hard to achieve, like very expensive, whether time, money, you name it. It's hard, right? it's probably not accessible to most, the vast majority of organizations, certainly those under, let's say, 1,000 people or something like that, 500 people, 100 people. So that's kind of an interesting area, and obviously represents a large part of the defense industrial base that has to be compliant with it by the end of the year. And something I think we'll definitely do as an industry is I think we'll make it a lot easier to meet the standard through technology over, let's say, the next 5 years. I think that's something that will definitely happen, certainly the next 10 years. So then the place the thought experiment comes in is, well, to what extent will it be the right framework 10 years from now? And I think or the right goal, let's say 10 years from now. And I think there's a few things that could change this, right? Like one is some of the underlying technology, right? If either different types of devices or like networks or means of data transmission, you name it, right? That's something that could change. The nature of the threat landscape is something that could change it, of course, as well. And there's, a long list of these things. But that's really the thing I wonder about, as a lot of people are in the pursuit of, making these frameworks, these standards, a little more accessible, more achievable. I think cheaper to meet, cheaper in the most general sense of the word. To what extent will that work be like relevant? In 10 years, I think is a pretty interesting question. And then obviously you have the good hearts thing, law thing as well, which is like when you have a rule like that, people just kind of shoot to hit the letter of the rule and miss out on the broader framework, but or the broader goals, but we could put that aside for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think the NIST regularly, and I think it's part of their process. This is what they do. It's like they're supposed to be regular updates and changes to those, and for anyone outside of something highly regulated, specific to and subject to laws for meeting these like to the T, you should not take it just kind of wholesale and say, oh, it works for me. If you're outside of the defense industrial base, then you don't have to do CMMC. You have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to apply, I think, you have to go back. You have to take a step back further and just say, kind of like, well, what risk are you managing for? Are you also trying to protect controlled, unclassified information? Are you trying to protect, and that kind of depends, right? I think for any of the frameworks and for any of the standards out there, I mean, you have to do it based on like the risk you're trying to manage for your company. An e-commerce company, you're worried about cardholder data getting breached. So you build a program around that, right? You build a program around that. You start from, where the cardholder data is, how you collect it, how you store it, how you encrypt it, and what systems and individuals get access to it. You build your program around that. But you can't build for every risk either. I think that's the thing. I think people, I don't know what people think. I haven't surveyed everyone, but I'd venture to guess a lot of people don't realize like even the biggest security programs are not meant to protect against any possible threat. That is truly impossible. Like you have to pick the threats and losses that you are worried about, and then you can take a highly quantitative loss event scenario, cyber risk sort of quantification approach to that, which would be great if you could. And, then you could really dial in the dollars and cents that you're spending and optimizing for that. But even without lifting a finger on a spreadsheet, you should just know as a business, like, what do you stand to lose? And then that's kind of where you should start. Like you could have that conversation. That conversation is free, by the way. It's like, what do you stand to lose? Is it like you serve B2B customers and you have contractual obligations that if you breach those contracts, then you will owe some amount of money in addition to, and what is your maximum liability? So those limitation liability clauses, for B2B companies, is kind of important. And, for a B2C company, that's where laws are there because there aren't great contracts and recourse for end users with a lot of consumer products. And so you have GDPR, you have CCPA, you have other things in place because otherwise you don't have the same legal recourse B2B business relationship, has kind of inherent in the nature of these two entities being able to go litigate against one another. Individuals have a high bar to go after a big company, class action lawsuits and all the other hurdles and to really build the case. But, I just think it's, people should just be like, it's like, what are you trying to manage for? And actually kind of look at that because I don't know what all the money is being spent on too. And this is where I think there's like this lack of like our industry spends this big pot of money. And like both in the solutions we're building and the people that we need to go do something, a lot of it is on a very specific, seemingly like narrow set of use cases and things. A lot of companies don't actually know what risk they're managing. I just know this. Like I just so many companies have never asked themselves.
Is just missing in so many cases of what are we trying to do here in the first place.
And so if you add 1 million people to this, will it solve it? No. Unless 1 million people are going to be specifically working on what risk are we trying to solve. But I venture to guess you go infuse 1 million people in there, you're just going to add them to what we already have. And at the end of the day, a lot of companies still aren't asking that question because they built security programs kind of for yesterday's problems.
Yeah, of course. There's like a famous article or something. It's like, what's the right amount of fraud to have in the financial system, or something like this. And I mean, all these ideas are super important, but I think they're even more important in security because I think something I see a lot in security related conversations is a bit of like an absolutist mindset sometimes. It's like,
Oh
well,
yeah,
if we're not going to like solve for all these cases, why are we bothering? And this is all the economic things that you're talking about before. Well, there's pretty good reasons to solve the 80% case, and not go ahead and solve the 20% case. And if we could take those a couple, 2, 3 steps forward for the general
yeah,
organization, you're in great shape. You're in great shape. But
it,
as you said, like
yeah.
most people can't really, even security professionals, I think. But I, it's something I sometimes pitch about is like most people, if you say like, all right, for your business, what's like one like top risk you'd want to kind of protect against, much less like give me the top 10 in order. It's a tough question, right? And I think rightfully so, because there are all sorts of risks. Obviously, you have to think about your business or whatever you're trying to protect from a cybersecurity standpoint. But people don't really like to think about these things, right? It's like when I leave my house and I lock my door behind me, I'm not thinking about like I mean, I do because, but, but, it's like not really, the goal is to not have to be thinking about those things for sure. The goal is to understand like, hey, what are the couple big risks? What are the couple big actions we could take here? And, that's probably the 80% case. And
So
a
that
lot
would
of
be
times,
great. It'd be great if we could reduce the cognitive load required because there's so many decisions to make in security, so people could focus on making the best decisions, not the ones that matter. Because if we have to spend our time thinking about both the mundane things because we can't trust that, and the complicated things because we're really surely not doing much about that, and then layer on top of that just the normal transaction cost of working in a large institution or organization with all kinds of process requirements and otherwise known as bureaucracy, and layers of management, which is normal. Well, chances are something bad's going to happen, and it's not for lack of trying. It's just we have piled on every possible sort of hurdle and barrier and put it on the small group of people, and then we said, "Good luck, secure the company." And we're like, "Why weren't you successful at stopping every single thing? I don't understand. We gave you a budget, you have a team, you have tools. What's the big deal? I don't understand."
well, it'd be a phenomenally interesting exercise to me to, I don't know if you did this in any of the larger organizations you worked in, but to kind of define that contrapositive case of like, here are the things we actually expect to happen because of what we're prioritizing instead. I suspect that this is not an exercise that happens in many places.
It took me some time, and I learned a lot from going through this process. And where we ended up at one of my previous employers is actually there. And it seems like you just made it seem so easy. There were so many steps we went through and so much pain. And then we realized, like, let's just define what we want to happen.
Right.
Let's just focus on limit ourselves and our excitement over technology to those risks to the company that we all agree need something to be done about. And then that's what we'll build. That's our budget. That's our plan. That's our risk. We will model that. And then we'll look at, okay, are we doing enough about it through the variety of tools available to us? Insurance, self-insurance, the technology itself. And then that was kind of like, that was, I think that was working towards that ideal of like, can we get to the 80%? And this is a question that I would always get asked. It would be like, Nick, are we secure? It's just like you get, and I felt,
Were
and
you?
it's like, and you couldn't answer that question without all this like nuance and finesse and dancing around and saying like, well, we're doing everything we can about this because we don't live in a world where like there's too many variables outside of our control. The way the technology exists and that just sort of hasn't changed. It's sort of like we've only moved who manages our infrastructure, but the way the infrastructure works, how computers work, and just kind of like memory, storage, data, compute, just processing has fundamentally changed for decades now since like I mean, PCBs are still PCBs, and the way silicon works and how processors work, they process information the exact same way they used to, faster, smaller, with less heat. But it's kind of like, no, we are as secure as we can be. We are as secure as you've given us a budget to be within the constraints of the laws of physics and all this stuff. It is like, and this is where I'm being a little bit of an idealist. I just hope at some point it's like we will live in a world where we have changed enough of our technology and we've actually changed the problem that we have, so that people can answer that question a little more confident. Be like, with 80% confidence, like, yeah, we're secure as we can be. We're as secure as we need to be, because we're doing all those things that we want to be doing. We're not saying that like nothing can happen to us, but we're not saying that the most, I don't know. It's always just fishing anyways, right? I don't know what, I guess I don't even know why we're having this conversation when it all just boils down to fishing. We should just, it's like, give up now. And it's just kind of like, well, we're doing everything we can. I want people to be able to answer that question. I think all of us want to be able to answer that question, because I think a lot of us, maybe mentally, I know for myself, it's like, it is an unrealistic bar to hold ourselves to. But that's kind of whether someone is asking us or we're asking ourselves. It's kind of like, and then maybe from there you can kind of, you go from there. What
Right.
do you want? That contrapositive thing where it's like, but what is secure for your company? And and hopefully it's not 100%, because it's kind of impossible. So, but thanks for taking the time today, Josh, to come chat and I think share your thoughts and perspectives on everything from kind of like the vendor space, being a security practitioner, and this next million job gap, the missing million. That I just we, even if it is true or not true, there's just a lot we need to do now, and we need to start doing it.
So. No, thanks so much for having me on, Nick. I appreciate it. Hopefully, I held my own, and you'll have me on again. But I love what you're doing with the podcast here, because I do think in general something our industry could do a hell of a lot better job at is thinking about the ways in which we can make things in all different pockets of security more accessible, whether that's in something like, some of the stuff we're talking about here, something low levels like malware reverse engineering. I think it's something we could be doing a lot better across the board. And I think the podcast has gone a long way to help that out. So thanks for what you're doing with the podcast, and thanks for having me on.
No problem, man. Have a good one.